Frank, are we on?
1 second.
We're live. You're live.
All right. Thank you and welcome everyone to this Great Lakes Advisory Board meeting. I am Todd Nettesheim. I'm the Deputy Director of EPA's Great Lakes National Program Office, and I'm the designated federal officer for the Great Lakes Advisory Board. I just want to welcome everyone that's participating in this advisory board public meeting via the YouTube link. Greatly appreciate your interest and desire to learn about the activities of the board. I think first what we are going to do is provide a quick overview of the agenda for today's meeting, and then we can dive into it. All right, can everyone of the board members, can you see that, the agenda well?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
All right, great. Today, the purpose of today's meeting is for the board to review and discuss as an entire board the draft recommendations that they have put together for the 3 charge questions that EPA has charged the Great Lakes Advisory Board with. And those charge questions relate to the development of the next Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI, Action Plan 4, which will cover fiscal years 2024 through 2025 through fiscal year 2029. So the purpose is for the board to review that. A big chunk of the agenda, as you can see here, from 12:15 to 1:15. Is for the 2 work groups that have been formed, and those work groups are chaired by Kyle Dreyfus-Wells and Al Steinman to discuss those draft recommendations, for other work group members to chime in and offer their perspectives, but then the entire board to review and discuss those draft recommendations. So we will have a time slot for the Great Lakes Advisory Board Stakeholder Environmental Justice Work Group, and the Great Lakes Advisory Board Climate Resiliency Work Group. We will have an opportunity for the entire board to discuss the drafting of the overall final recommendations report, and then also an opportunity for those members that registered in advance to provide public comments during this meeting. And we do have 3 individuals that have requested to provide oral public comments during this meeting. And at that time, we'll work with our contractors here to bring you on the Zoom call and offer you an opportunity to present. Scudder, anything you wanted to add on the agenda for today?
No, I think the agenda is just fine the way it is. So I think we're good to go. Yep.
All right, so I just want to briefly provide a welcome from EPA, the Great Lakes National Program Office, not only on behalf of EPA and Glencoe, but of the entire regional working group that comprises the 16 federal agencies that oversee the implementation of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The work of this board is incredibly important to ensure that our next action plan for the GLRI is better than even the current action plan that we have. We're a bit biased. We think the current one is good, but there's always room for growth and opportunity. And we're very excited to see the draft recommendations that are here, and for the board to continue to discuss those draft recommendations on 2 very important priorities within this administration: environmental justice and climate change, climate resiliency. So I just want to provide a real quick thank you. And I want to express my gratitude to all the board members that are volunteering their time, in addition to all the work that they do to provide their expertise and their perspectives from their own organizations and the organizations that they represent, to help make the GLRI a better program, but more importantly, to help make the Great Lakes a better place for all to enjoy. With that, Scudder, I'd like to pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. Really appreciate the sort of the setting the stage and the framework for what we're going to be discussing today and presenting today in terms of our draft recommendations. We have three charge questions that we were tasked to address. The first charge question is focused on stakeholder and public engagement, specifically related to how can US EPA better engage with the public as it is developing action plan 4. The second charge question is focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmental justice. And we were charged with making a set of recommendations as to how US EPA and their federal partners can incorporate these DEIJ elements into Action Plan 4, and how can we better address the needs of underserved and or underinvested Great Lakes communities. The third charge question is focused on climate resiliency. I think most everyone would agree that we're seeing these days some significant changes in the climate and climate patterns here in the Great Lakes, changing water levels, increased storms. And so US EPA has asked us, can we make some recommendations as to how can we incorporate climate into the investments that are made by US EPA so that those investments are resilient and continue to protect and enhance the environment and coastal communities in the face of climate change. So we formed two work groups. The first work group basically was tasked to come up with a set of recommendations for questions 1 and 2. Those two questions are charge questions are very closely interlinked. There are a lot of synergies. And then charge question 3 focused on climate resiliency was the purview of the second work group. So that sort of sets the stage in terms of how these recommendations are going to be presented. And the next thing is I would like to introduce the members of the Great Lakes Advisory Board. And I would like each of them, as I call their names, and this is in alphabetical order, just to state your name and what your affiliation is for the board members. So Larry, why don't you start off?
Yes, good afternoon. Larry Antosh. I'm with the Ohio Farm Bureau representing the agricultural interests.
Okay. Kyle?
Kyle Dreyfus Wells, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District.
Frank?
I'm Frank Etowah-Gashek. I'm the Executive Director of the United Tribes of Michigan.
Lisa?
Lisa Freedy, Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Chemical Industry Council of Illinois.
John?
Hi, John Hull, a Senior Principal with Verdantis, representing the consulting industry.
And I'm Scudder Mackey. I'm with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Kay?
Good afternoon. I'm Kay Nelson. I'm Director of Environmental Affairs and Public Policy for the Northwest Indiana Forum, a regional economic development organization.
Sylvia?
Good afternoon. I'm Sylvia Orduno. I'm a community organizer with Michigan Welfare Rights Organization.
Laura?
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Rubin. I'm the director of the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition.
And Ellen?
Al Steinman, a research professor at the Annis Water Resources Institute at Grand Valley State University.
We have another member, Chairman James Williams. I don't believe he is able to be present today. So this is the Great Lakes Advisory Board, and these folks have been working very hard over since for more than a year and a half now in terms of dealing with these issues and coming up with a set of recommendations that we will share with you very quickly. So what I'd like to do is let's start off with the recommendations and a presentation to start with Kyle Dreyfus Wells from the Stakeholder and Environmental Justice Work Group. We'll run through these slides. The individual work group members feel free to add as you need to the discussion, and then we'll move on to climate resiliency. So take it away, Kyle.
Thank you, Scudder, and hello, everyone. I will just note that I have had some connectivity issues with my computer, not, my personality. But if you have any issues hearing me, just interrupt and let me know, and we'll see what we can do. So again, I'm Kyle Dreyfus-Wells. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and it's been great to be part of this Great Lakes Advisory Board. So myself and my colleague Sylvia Orduno are going to talk about our responses, our recommendations for charge questions 1 and 2. As Scudder pointed out, these deal with public engagement, and then diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So our work group members included myself, Lisa Freedy, Kay Nelson, Sylvia Orduno, Laura Rubin, and Chairman Williams. And so first, let's look at this charge question for public engagement. So the big, broad question, and hold on, I just need to move all your lovely faces out of the way. Here we go. The big question was, what does the board, so the Great Lakes Advisory Board, recommend to ensure effective and representative public input into the development of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan 4? And this question included 5 parts, and we're going to go through our recommendations to those questions, to those subparts in each slide. But these are the subparts. Should EPA and the regional work group use a similar format of engagement as was done with Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan 3? Then what specific steps could be taken to ensure that we provide meaningful engagement for disadvantaged communities, and obviously for all communities, but with a specific focus on disadvantaged communities? What groups and organizations could help EPA and the regional work group conduct meaningful engagement with disadvantaged communities? And then the next 2 subparts start with statements and then a question. So the first statement is, many disadvantaged communities have already shared their priorities and perspectives to EPA and other agencies on a variety of environmental topics. I just want to put a pin in the point that those disadvantaged communities might not agree with that statement, but that is the beginning of the question that came into this subpart. So how can we effectively incorporate and leverage this previous input? And we'll talk about that. And then finally, there is likely a lack of familiarity with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in many disadvantaged communities. So what information and or materials could be developed and shared beforehand, so before a public engagement event, to facilitate meaningful engagement? And as we go through our response to these questions, to our recommendations, I really want to point out holistically that our recommendations focus on more sustained relationships. That's really the theme. So sustained relationships with communities beyond public sessions that are done with each action plan. The idea here, as we all know, that relationships are made before you need them. That's kind of the guiding principle to our recommendations. And work group folks, please, I'll pause as we go through each recommendation. So jump in if you want to. And then if other folks have questions, just drop those into the chat and we'll try to pick those up. But let's look at the first subpart. So this first subpart to this question was, should EPA and the regional work group use a similar format of engagement as was done in Action Plan 3? And the first answer is straight up simple, no. The Great Lakes Advisory Board appreciates the efforts of the Great Lakes National Program Office to improve effective and representative public input, but it really appears from our work on this Great Lakes Advisory Board, and then many of us served, I think actually all of us served on previous Great Lakes Advisory Boards, it really appears that more is needed in terms of greater outreach and inclusivity. And then we talked about a couple things that we would suggest in terms of GLENPO providing a public report on its engagement efforts under Action Plan 2 and Action Plan 3, including the locations, participation numbers, summary of concerns and feedback, local priorities that folks raised, and the types of media or communications tools and networks that were used as part of this public outreach, and then what changes were implemented in response to the previous recommendations that have come from the Great Lakes Advisory Board. The point here is that it's our responsibility sort of collectively as environmental professionals to take the tools that we have and help solve the priorities that people raise. It's not the public's responsibility to conform their priorities to the tools that we have. And it's really understanding that, that relationship. So when we talk about local priorities, we're talking about anything related to water quality, public health, and environmental justice issues, and then trying to solve those with the tools that are there, as opposed to asking the public to conform to the tools. And then a focus on using different formats of engagement in Action Plan 4 than were used for Action Plan 3 to directly reach out to impacted residents and groups that just are not going to come to a public input session. I think we have to acknowledge that these public input sessions to date are not compelling to folks who are not sort of already in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative universe. All right, so that's the first one. Work group folks, anything you want to jump in on that? I'm getting a thumbs up from Kay, so I'm going to keep rolling, and we'll do a big sweep up before I turn it over to Sylvia. All right, so the next subgroup of this question is, what specific steps could be taken to ensure we provide meaningful engagement with disadvantaged communities? And really, the focus here is on establishing a new public engagement approach for Action Plan 4 that is more focused on in-person meetings in each area of concern. And then there's the next two bullets really talk about how to establish this new approach for public engagement. So coming up with different formats. Again, going on the idea that we go to the public. We don't require the public to come to us. Interviews, focus groups, testimonials that focus on listening to community concerns and priorities regarding their experiences in the Great Lakes Basin. So again, don't expect members of disadvantaged communities and all communities to fit within predetermined input formats. And then work with local groups, so folks who are in community, to talk with local groups and leaders to discuss how the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative vocabulary can really be in some ways exclusionary and can kind of keep folks from engaging. So include resources in these sort of preparatory sessions to ensure that folks are comfortable participating, that they kind of know the power of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and how it can resonate for them. Okay, as we look at the next part of this question, going on, Frank, to the next slide, the question is, what groups and organizations could help EPA and the regional work groups conduct meaningful engagement with disadvantaged communities? And we talk about really 3 areas where EPA can focus. So community groups that work on water quality, public health, and environmental justice issues. And then also within Region 5, talking to the environmental justice folks on the contacts that they have made, and again, the relationship that they have built. So community groups, and then environmental groups that work across the basin, watershed networks, land conservancies, water quality advocates, nonprofit organizations. And then finally, universities and colleges, including tribal and historically Black institutions that have community-based relationships and also have initiatives around local leadership and priorities, because these issues around water quality, public health, environmental justice are coming up when folks are having conversations about other issues. So you want to be part of those conversations. Again, getting in to the mix with folks. I'll pause. Work group folks, you want to add anything? All right, keep rolling. Okay, then as we go on to the next sub part, this focuses on many disadvantaged communities have already shared their priorities and perspectives to EPA and other agencies on a variety of environmental topics. Again, with the caveat that I'm sure many have, but many may feel that they have not had opportunities to be heard. So how can we effectively incorporate and leverage this previous input? I think the first thing goes back to this idea of EPA and the regional work group staff writing a report annually on what they've heard from disadvantaged communities and providing summaries at public meetings of what action steps have been taken and are in progress. It's so important to write this down because it's a way of saying, of checking in. Did we hear you correctly? Are we articulating this correctly? Is this what you meant? And that is so powerful, that back and forth exchange about what the priorities are among communities. And then the action plan public input organizers need to be clear and direct on what kind of input they're interested in receiving and then how it will be used. And the questions that are asked during these sessions need to articulate how they can be integrated into action plan for work. Very important that the folks that are on the ground conducting these meetings need to be educated in the issues that are relevant in local community and be able to respond to those concerns that might not be action plan related and direct folks to the appropriate agencies. So say, for example, you come to Cleveland, you're going to hear about basement flooding. I guarantee 100%. And you're going to hear about concerns about lead. And those might not be action plan related, but if you're on the ground, you need to have the same folks in the room that can pick up with those community members and have those conversations. So it's that integrated approach. And then finally, as we go to the last part of this question, there is likely a lack of familiarity with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in many disadvantaged communities. So what information and materials could be developed and shared beforehand to facilitate meaningful engagement? Again, going back to showing that you understand the issues that are in a specific community. So EPA should share a summary of what it has heard so far from the community and a summary of what has been discussed with other disadvantaged communities. Again, showing this integration into the process. Pointing out that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is largely a science-based endeavor and could benefit from more inclusive and accessible language on the handouts and the web pages so that the general public understands its applicability to their communities. The idea here is it's not the public's job to understand what we're talking about. It's our job to explain what we're talking about. And if we can't explain it, my feeling is you don't really understand it. That's a kind of a touchstone in our public outreach that at least that we do at the sewer district, and a big conversation that we had at the work group. So materials need to be clear with simple definitions of terminology to be helpful, alongside visual examples of how the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has improved conditions in disadvantaged communities, being loud and proud about what the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has accomplished and making sure that it's really resonates with the communities that you're talking to. So that is a summary of our recommendations around public engagement. I'll turn it over to Sylvia to pick up on charge question 2. But work group folks, did you want to add anything before we switch over?
Hey, Kyle.
Yeah.
If I may just make a comment, and I think Laura will follow. One thing I think that's very important to point out is that stakeholder engagement just doesn't occur when you're developing a new action plan. Okay, that stakeholder engagement has to be, 24, whatever, 24/7, 365. It needs to be continuous. It needs to be done all the time. I'm not sure I get my numbers right, but that's okay. I'm bad at math, okay, folks? But the point is that this is something that needs to be a continuous process, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's the point. And Laura, over to you in a second. That's the point of relationships are made before you need them. That is the whole point, is that it's a long, sustained understanding of what's going on in community. Thank you, Scudder. Go ahead, Laura.
Mine was the same point pretty much as Scudder, which is that this isn't just something we do around the action plans updates, that these should be relationships that are being built all of the time, and engagement where GLRI is building relationships and getting feedback.
Absolutely. Any other work group comments? Go ahead, Sylvia.
Thanks so much, Kyle, for all of this and what other folks have already contributed. I think just even on that last point, though, about relationships, is they're not going to be necessarily natural for some communities as they are for others. And so part of that is that intentionality about making sure that you really have a good understanding about which communities are regularly participating, which ones are not, and what else has to be done in order to be able to engage with those folks. Because in part, they're about matters of trust, right? And whether or not folks have felt like they've been included or set to the side whenever their issues have come up. But even issues like when you're making the example there about the basement backups, Kyle, in Cleveland, similarly, we have those same problems in Detroit and in many other communities where we've got CSOs. But again, being able to connect those household levels with what ends up happening when we're not able to manage those issues and folks don't have the resources to be able to control them, and what happens when people are dumping into sewers and they don't realize the consequences, right? So the conversations have to be able to also happen very much at a household level so that people can understand how they connect to the greater Great Lakes issues. So thank you all for what you've been doing.
Absolutely. Okay. Over to you, Sylvia.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. So I'm going to ask if someone maybe just control the slides for me, and then I'll just say next. Okay. So again, this is the second of the two charge questions, which focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so these issues are many that we're familiar with in our different sort of community and work experiences, but they have an extra level of, I guess, like addedness because of what is going on with this current administration. The EPA administrator in particular has made it a very big point of ensuring that there is a lot more being done through his administration and through the White House administration to ensure that we're really building upon these as benchmarks for the work that is being happening across the federal government. And so particularly when we're talking about this in the context of Action Plan 4, we wanted to make sure that also GLMPO and all of the work that it's leading through EPA with the other work group members is really part of the conversation. And so this means in part that there has to be a way to understand who's doing what and how. So as we get into the next slide there, please, we're beginning the recommendations with really trying to go back to one of the charge questions that says, how are we including Justice 40 and its relationship to GLRI? And then how is it that we're making references to what those opportunities are to benefit disadvantaged communities? So at their essence, it's really about making sure that there's an understanding about what it is that Justice 40 encompasses and what's already been done to sort of lay out the framework for that. The White House has done a considerable amount of work to be able to also pull this together in a series of documents on the website. And so we've got links there in the slides that we'll certainly be sharing like as part of the final or formal report. But among those are looking at what are the different organizations or agencies within the work group for GLRI and what it is that they're doing. So we know that EPA is leading up this work and that GLMPO in particular is sort of facilitating these meetings. But when we look at across the other agencies like Agriculture, Commerce, US Army, HHS, State, Homeland Security, Interior, Transportation, it's important to also look at the whole of all these agencies and what it is that they're doing in response to the Justice 40 objectives. And so many of them, again, have listed some of the specific ways in which they are framing their responses or trying to help build better inclusion by how it is that their programs are operating. And I think it's important for that to be a more well-rounded conversation within the work group as we make these recommendations going forward. Another component of that is just really looking more specifically at like what the EPA administrator is saying, as I noted. We also had the benefit of being able to have a meeting with Matthew Tejada, who is the assistant administrator for the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, the new national program, who again kind of gave us a briefing on the priorities of what his office is doing, but also across the EPA to really ensure that environmental justice and these issues around DEIJ are being properly incorporated across the agency. Among those ways in which they are establishing a plan and the priorities around them is through the strategic plan, the EPA strategic plan. And so when we look more closely at that, there are a number of things that are important to just note for folks that are not familiar with the plan itself. And there are several goals within it. So for instance, among them are tackling the climate crisis, taking decisive action to advance environmental justice and civil rights, enforcing environmental laws and ensuring compliance, ensuring clean and healthy air for all communities, and clean and safe water for all communities, as well as safeguarding and revitalizing communities, ensuring safety of chemicals for people and the environment. And so as the GLRI action plan is being developed, many of those goals should also be looked at in terms of how it is that they can be implemented into objectives and outcomes within the GLRI. So the next page, please. So then as we're looking, sorry, let me get my pages straight here. Then as we're looking at how it is that environmental justice can best be incorporated into the action plan, especially given the level of detail that we've discussed in previous plans, we were asked to look at action plan 3 as a template. And so this was actually a good exercise, but one of the things that we were especially fortunate to have was that the work of Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition had actually done a deep dive on this and had much public engagement with their members and other partners to be able to get a sense of what kinds of improvements could be built in context of environmental justice and DEIJ. So we were like wholly supportive of many of those recommendations, and they helped us in many ways with being able to get our own kind of clarity around our own recommendations. What we ended up doing was, again, pretty much signing onto those, but we felt that we needed to add some additional pieces that strengthened what it is that we wanted to do to ensure that they were more closely tied with specific environmental justice or DEI recommendations. And so you'll see here in the next few when I go through them what those are. But overall, one of the things that we wanted to ensure was that we're seeing the GLRI responses to the Equity Action Plan. And I didn't put a link there, but we'll be sure we put that into the report. Because in the EPA Equity Action Plan, there are, again, several priorities. In fact, I believe there are 6, and they include things like developing a comprehensive framework for how cumulative impacts are being considered in EPA decisions and how they're operationalizing that framework in programs and activities, and something, again, that we would very much want to see in how it is that GLRI is operationalized. This would also include another priority about building the capacity of underserved communities. Other ones would be about developing the EPA's internal capacity to engage underserved communities and implement clear and accountable processes to act based on those communities' input. Another one of the priorities within the Equity Action Plan is what are those EPA external civil rights compliance programs that ensure civil rights compliance is an agency-wide responsibility. And in the context of discussions around areas of concern, you know, we would want to make sure that civil rights compliant is another one of the components that folks are looking at. Again, the last 2 priorities within like that Equity Action Plan include integrating community science into EPA's research and program implementation, and making EPA's procurement and contracting more equitable. And that certainly gets at the conversations we've had about how it is that resources are allocated. Another matter is we know that it's been a priority for this administration to ensure that staff are participating in training programs that improve their understanding and awareness of environmental justice and DEIJ. Additionally, like how it is that we're just developing overall a baseline of understanding among staff and stakeholders on what are those EJ issues within historically underserved communities, how to also prepare upcoming updates to what the EPA's public engagement document will be. And fortunately, there's something that EPA headquarters is working on that I think will be pretty beneficial to GRLI work group and other stakeholder communities. There's also the matter of outlining the Justice 40 goals, as we mentioned, for GLRI, developing an EJ glossary. Later on the recommendations, we mentioned that it'd be good to actually have those as part of additions to the website. And then also, as folks already noted, continuing to do public engagement on an ongoing basis. So next, please. So when we look now more specifically, like at some of the focus areas around Action Plan 3 and how Action Plan 4 can be improved, I'm going to just kind of go through these a little bit more quickly. So among them are, for instance, providing guidance within focus area 1, which is on toxic substances and areas of concern, providing guidance to states for the development of diverse public advisory councils. And so again, that gets at really how inclusionary the process is and whether or not there is adequate engagement and reaching out to people that are particularly impacted. There should also be developing opportunities for impacted community members around remediation and beneficial use projects, specifically within equitable terms. Next slide, please. So this one, when we're looking at focus area 2 around invasive species, developing and enhancing measures to conduct outreach in disproportionately impacted communities, integrating traditional ecological knowledge or TEK measures and technology methodologies that refine techniques based on what tribal and indigenous communities have been practicing and within their histories. Focus area 3, nearshore health and resilience. We're looking at recommendations that encourage the establishing of collaboratives to connect upstream and downstream communities, particularly when residents of vulnerable areas. And again, like many of these are how recommendations that we're emphasizing with some additional language and additional recommendations. The next one here is working with existing programs and identifying new opportunities for watershed-based water quality measures in EJ communities, supporting innovative approaches and projects to meet water quality measures or progress among those kinds of non-traditional partners. Next, please. Focus area 4, habitat restoration and native species, looking at identifying climate warming protections in national forests and state and municipal lands or related to canopy restoration, offsetting warming waterways and cold water fisheries, again, with attention specifically to the deliberate consideration of EJ communities. Looking at habitat resilience goal improvements and objectives that include disadvantaged community health and well-being, working with EJ communities and community researchers to identify areas in lakes for interdisciplinary research and how to better adapt management to improve offshore native fishing populations. Partnering with groups in historically underserved communities to educate and develop quantifiable targets for offshore phosphorus concentrations. Next slide, please. Focus area 5, around foundations for future restoration actions. This one would include, again, incorporating TEK and Justice 40 climate and environmental justice screening tools, the CGIST as it's known out of the White House, into GLRI adaptive management process for decision-making within disadvantaged communities, as well as a supporting capacity building for outcomes in historically underserved communities. So again, that we're expanding their knowledge and ability around sustainable economic development, workforce development, sustainable land use among residents in disadvantaged communities. We're also looking at expanding the Great Lakes EJ Grants Program, which actually just closed on Friday. That would allow for seed funding for EJ communities and groups to learn about the GLRI, engage disadvantaged communities, and draft initial proposals that address Great Lakes environmental conditions. And we'll be, I know, very interested in learning more later about the number and types of applications that came through on that to see how successful it turned out. On the next slide, please. There were some other things that we wanted to see added that were beyond what it was that we were asked to look at in building upon Action Plan 3. And so among those are that there really needs to be a more human-centered health goal among the GRI goals. That yes, it's very much important for us to continue to improve the quality of the lakes at an ecological level and what it means for the long-term sustainability of having a healthy environment, but that we also need to do more to include human-centered health outcomes. And that really plays into the issues when we talk about disadvantaged communities, cumulative impacts, areas of concern, and how it is that we're tying in health metrics in a broader way. And so that would also mean to really recognize better what those cleanup and restoration and resiliency needs are among historically disadvantaged communities, especially where they've not been prioritized or had adequate resources. Another point, as I mentioned earlier, particularly around like a glossary, is that we saw that there were some areas that could be improved even on the GLRI website itself in terms of making it more accessible. And so among those are like boosting the keyword search capability, you know, some background things that we're sure that your tech team should be able to help improve, adding a glossary of terminology so that lay people can also understand, you know, what some of the language is, right, in more accessible ways. But also making it so that, because we've got a variety of communities with different language, especially if their primary language is not English, to make it so that the GRLRI website can be able to manage translation in other language. And there's tools and add-ons that can be, I'm sure, incorporated in there. But then also when the reports are going to Congress, they're pretty lengthy and they get into a lot of detail, but there needs to be something that actually is a more condensed, friendly, read, accessible language kind of report that we suggest be available to communities so that they can be more easily understood and people can get a summary of what those program benefits and improvements are, again, particularly for underserved communities. And then lastly, the final slide there are again about additional comments and measures for progress. We're thinking that there really needs to be a way to have some kind of convening of Great Lakes region stakeholders to go through like a strategy session that brings in environmental justice leaders, groups, advocates, impacted communities, so that they can really talk about their concerns with the GRLRI process, the programs, projects, and be able to have a different format for what that kind of engagement in concerns can be raised. And that we also look at what is going on now with the EPA's Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers. There are a lot of resources, a lot of people who are very much interested in making connections between those sort of household and community-based issues. And this would be a perfect place to really connect them also with what is going on with the GLRI. And also those same spaces in the Tic Tacs are also having to rely upon relationship building and making so that communities can get resources and responses to a lot of things that have not been able to be managed through sort of traditional avenues. We also really believe that like it's an enormous resource for GLEMPO to also be based alongside the Region 5 staff who have considerable experience in the region with working alongside environmental justice groups and communities, have a number of contacts, have built relationships over the years, and so it would seem to make sense to work more closely with them in partnership for the GLRI and the development of the action plan to really see like how it is that there can be more of a beneficiary relationship between the groups, so that it's not necessarily GLEMPO folks having to figure it out on their own, just really build off of what Region 5 EJ coordinators have been doing pretty well. Also, we're really believing that there has to be more of a connection too between connecting climate impacts and environmental justice around the Great Lakes and how the GRLI is responding to those overlapping concerns, as well as drafting a more nuanced report, as we mentioned, with the kind of internal and external assessments for improvements and action steps that also are particular to EJ communities. So we know that's a whole bunch, and we're going to figure out, like in the report, how to sort of break it down into chunks that will hopefully also do what we're asking Glenpo to do, which is make this in accessible language. So thanks very much. I'll turn it back to you, Kyle.
Thanks, Sylvia. So Scudder, that is our recommendations. We're happy to take any questions or I don't know if work group folks want to jump in. Obviously, as Sylvia pointed out, we leaned heavily on the work that Laura's group, Healing Our Waters, has done, and super appreciative of all that really detailed analysis.
Well, thank you very much, Kyle and Sylvia. I think we can take a few minutes here. If any of the GLAB members have any questions or comments, feel free to speak up. I may have one or two comments as well. So I'll defer to other members of the GLAB at this point before I jump in.
This is Frank Edowageshik, and I wanted to in Sylvia's thing where she's talking about the human-centered health. The health activities. I found that this was particularly resonant with some of the thoughts that I've had, and in ways of, and I addressed some of that in our upcoming presentation. But the idea that the changing climate is going to put a big strain on not only our environmental justice communities, but on all of our communities. And the idea that the changes, the uncertainty of the changes is causing issues in terms of people's mental health. I know working with kids that are just scared to death about climate change and issues that are coming when I talk with them. Mental health, which affects physical health and actually affects social issues in terms of our communities, which gets me to one of the issues I think that we need to think about is that the idea of social, the concerns we have within our communities is going to have a big effect. And so not only is this is going to show up more strongly in those communities and populations that are most affected, but it's going to show up across the board. And I think this is something that as we look through the recommendations, we ought to be keeping in mind. So thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Scudder, this is Kay, and I thank both Sylvia and Kyle for their great representation of our conversations over the past months. And I would just like to point out to those who are, joining us today that everything in this arena is a constantly moving discussion, regardless of what federal agency we're talking with. And so what seems to be a no-brainer for us might be, an extremely eye-opening statement in another arena of the federal government and vice versa. So we recognize that we don't have every answer here in this list of suggestions, but we did spend a great deal of time and effort on getting to this point. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Scudder, the only thing
go ahead.
Hey,
Kyle.
Scudder, I just want to add, Sylvia and the work group members laid out a lot of great suggestions, but I do just want to make sure everyone understands that this is not complicated. This is not complicated. You just have to talk to people. And I don't mean to minimize, but I don't want our EPA and our Glenpo folks to be in any way intimidated by this. It's just a series of next steps, just keep on moving. What can we do next? What can we do better? How can we talk to more folks? How can we have more 24/7, 365 relationships? So I just want to sort of take the, there's no difficulty to this. Whatever you do, it's going to be good. You're going to have some crucial conversations, and they're going to be good, and they're going to be helpful, and they're going to make the GLRI much more resilient.
Scudder, this is John Hall. If I could add a comment or an observation. With this work going on at the federal level, and we're kind of advising the federal folks how they may be better communicate and involve the DEIJ community in these discussions. Is it premature to suggest that state partners in their implementation of programs that might be federally guided, maybe programs that the state has a primacy from an enforcement issue, or also a companion funding or grant program that there could be some discussion starting at the state level through GLNPO to see that state programs incorporate these same listening tactics and reporting tactics on this issue in their environmental programs.
Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting suggestion. I was thinking also of other maybe non-federal agencies. Obviously, these recommendations are not just going to US EPA, they're also going to the US EPA federal partners. You know, the NOAA, the US Army Corps of Engineers, US Fish and Wildlife Service, the United States Geological Survey. So these recommendations we're making, these are just a starting point, and these are going to be, you know, shared widely across the federal system. But I do think there's an opportunity to share this at the state level. I also think of a number of other either NGO organizations, but also, let's say, the Great Lakes Commission, where they are also looking at some of these very similar issues. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think there are opportunities to expand this much past just US EPA. And Todd, please.
Thanks, Scudder. And John, I think that's a great comment. I just wanted to let the advisory board know that, you know, although that the recommendations are coming into EPA and EPA on behalf of all the 16 federal agencies that make up the regional working group that oversees the GLRI, we also share these with our state and tribal partners who are our co-implementers on a lot of our activities under the GLRI. So, you know, I would say that that's sort of the minimal step, John, where these will reach our state and tribal partners. But we are also in conversations with our state and tribal partners on a variety of GLRI related issues. And, you know, given the magnitude of GLR Action Plan 4 and the magnitude of these recommendations coming in to guide Action Plan 4, I wouldn't be surprised if these are substantial conversations that we have with our partners going forward. I just wanted to let you know that.
Yep, thank you.
Yep. Larry, I think you've got your hand raised.
Yes, I do. Just given Kyle and folks, the discussions that you had, was there any mention of the need to change how and where meetings and how and where and when meetings take place for these conversations? You know, it's not everyone that works 9 to 5 that can go to a daytime meeting, and there's not a lot of agencies that have overtime that allow their folks to go to an overtime meeting at night. And so from that standpoint, there's a disconnect. And I didn't know if that came up at all in your discussions.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Larry. I'll start, and then Sylvia. Absolutely. I mean, changing the idea of having a meeting that you send out some flyers, maybe you do a little social media if you think you're fancy, and you do a PowerPoint and you ask people to come, that is over. I mean, maybe you have some of those because, you know, you want to make sure you're catching all folks, but that is the whole point, Larry, that you're highlighting. You've got to go where people are, because it is not their job to come to us. And I'm using the big us, like all of us that are professionals in this space. So that can be, you know, it can take many, many different forms. If I think about the Ohio Farm Bureau, It's reaching out through your conservation districts. It's going to the county fair. It's going to the events. It's getting involved. It's going where people are and having conversations of consequence with them about issues that they're interested in. So it's a lot more work on the part of all of us. And that's, I feel, is precisely how it should be. So you should always question, if you're holding a public meeting and you're thinking you're checking the box, you need to question if you're really doing it. So go ahead, Sylvia. Do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Kyle. And you're really hitting it on there. It's people have a lot of not so good choices about what they have to do each day, right? Beyond work and getting their kids to school and such. And oftentimes if people are already experiencing a number of issues, whether or not they're going to want to turn out to a meeting to hear what someone else has to say isn't going to be up there and where they're going to choose to spend their time, right? And it's not as if even participating a lot of times in public meetings is cost-free, right? Depending on the location, how much travel is going to be involved, even for local government meetings, right? Sometimes people are if they can't park in the street, having to park in some kind of structure that's going to end up costing. So people are having to make choices, right, about these things. But I think especially when we're trying to really figure out how to get people to participate that aren't traditionally engaged in these sorts of things, we have to connect on issues where they are already experiencing problems, right? And it's not usually going to just be one thing. So this is where, again, those relationships come in with being able to talk with whatever grassroots or local groups you're working with, community-based groups, and saying, look, this is something that's coming through. It might need a level of translation for people to just understand what the GLRI is, but let's try to figure out how it is that we can connect it to what local communities are interested in talking about, so that you start finding ways to kind of build in interest in this, because it's not that people don't or won't see the relevance, but it's not immediate, right? This is not an obvious thing for most people to get just off the top, unless you're already a scientist or someone who's been doing this through some sort of way that your organization has been a recipient of funds, right? In order to actually make it more of a democratic exercise and something that really is about building greater civic engagement about communities across the Great Lakes, we've got to talk in the ways that people talk and are ready to listen as you connect it to what it is that they're dealing with on a daily basis. So what's happening at the schools, what's happening in the neighborhoods, what's happening at the household level. And then it's the job of others to help make the connections about what you pour down your drain or that basement backup. This is what ends up happening that has relevance to the larger ways that we want to protect and improve the Great Lakes, but also how it is that resources from non-traditional sources can also help benefit community-based problems. And I think that that's part of the connection around environmental justice, areas of concern that maybe could be strengthened. And maybe that there can be a space for more specific sort of project engagement tied in with that kind of community engagement need. That could be something that the GLRI folks think more about. Thanks. Beyond just the way the AOCs have gone. Thanks.
One other comment I would have, and we've had some internal discussions about this, and it's sort of the concept of reciprocity, in the sense that for these types of meetings and engagement that we have, information comes into EPA and then nothing comes back. And many times it doesn't come back, other than in the investments that are made through the evaluation and selection process. And so I think that there needs to be a mechanism where it's again, this is a 24/7, 365. I think I got the numbers right this time. It's a continuous process, okay? And that when EPA is out in the field, or when their federal partners are in the field and they're in the process of assisting local communities or engaging in project work, that they need to have that continual dialogue and engage those local communities. Bring them in, help them actually incorporate them into the project. And I think that direct engagement, what that does, and what we're really talking about here is earning the trust of these communities, okay, and being responsive to those communities. And that's not only at the federal level, but at the state and local level as well. I mean, that's what local government printing, you see people all the time on the street as a local government. We basically need to be like a local entity. We need to have that direct connection. And I think hopefully I'm starting to resonate here with the environmental justice group. But yeah, I think that's very important. And if there are ways that we can incorporate that into our final report and strengthen some of these recommendations with those concepts, I think that would be to our benefit and to the benefit of the Great Lakes. Any other comments on these two charge questions at this point amongst the work group? All righty. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Thank you very much, Kyle. I think it's time for us to move on to, yes, Laura is applauding. That's good. Well done. I think we need to move on to the climate resilience portion. We're running about 15 minutes ahead of time, which is just fine. More time to discuss at the end. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Al Steinman, who is the work group chair for the climate resiliency work group. And Al will go ahead and present on the recommendations developed by this work group. Thank you.
Thanks, Scudder, and thanks to Kyle and Sylvia for a very rich discussion and great recommendations. As Scudder said, our focus was on climate resilience, and here are the work group members that did much of the work. Larry Antosh, Frank Edegishik, and John Hall and Scudder Mackey also helped us on this. Next slide, please. So this was sort of the guidance that we received. There's some animation in these slides, so I apologize, but didn't want to overload you with text at the beginning. The guidance that we received before I get to the charge questions, one that EPA and the regional working group wanted to have the GLAB input on specific examples. Next animation, please. And again, same with the DEIJ group. They wanted us to use the action plan 3 as a template when providing recommendations. Next one, please. And then they were also interested in recommendations on how climate adaptation can be better incorporated into our definition of resilience. Next slide, please. So here are the formal charge questions. One, they wanted us to make recommendations on how climate adaptation and resilience may be better incorporated into that working definition. Next, please. Modify the working definition of resilience for the next action plan so that they could be more flexible and adaptive, and then continue to provide the functions, ecosystem functions and services in response to not just changing climate, but the other stressors facing the Great Lakes. Next, please. Provide specific examples of how climate can be incorporated into Action Plan 4, especially given the level of detail in the previous action plans. Next. And then look for synergies with DEIJ about climate resilience. And you certainly heard from Kyle and Sylvia where there's significant overlap that would occur, and we'll discuss that in more detail. Next slide, please. So this was the outline of our report, and it's also going to be the outline of how we focus on this. It's more of a narrative, I think, trying to tell a story about where climate resilience fits into Action Plan 4. And we'll go through each of these separate bullets shortly. Next slide, please. So with respect to implementation strategies, again, reflecting where EPA wanted us to go, we're recommending that adopt a more flexible approach towards project implementation. And what that means is that these grant applications should include a requirement that design and related permit applications get more consideration, analysis, and modeling to address the range of potential climatological and Great Lakes level, not just water level related phenomena, but other criteria as appropriate. Next, please. Consider project designs that identify multiple and varied BUI, beneficial use impairment improvements under a range of conditions and establish flexible metrics to be monitored post-implementation. And you'll see us talk a bunch about monitoring throughout the slide deck. And then finally, consider an approach to determine eligible post-construction budgets so that there's money available for performance monitoring and adaptive management, because let's face it, not all projects go according to plan. And then again, a recommendation that follows up from our last board meeting, the last GLAB, to set up a designated status reserve fund so that that would be available specifically for this kind of post-construction monitoring. Next slide, please. We now move into the summary description of changing climate and Great Lakes impacts. So we have a fair amount of text that I'm not going to give you today, but in the report talking about these, about the changing climate and the impacts associated with that. But specifically, we are recommending where and when possible that projects include stochastically generated time series of precipitation so that we can examine a range of possible weather and climate conditions, and that these time series can be coupled to plausible climate trends so that you have basically a cluster or a range of scenarios that evaluate project performance under future climate change and variability. And I kind of stole this literature. I serve on a National Academy committee overseeing Everglades restoration, and this is what we're recommending there for Everglades restoration, because let's face it, the climate, there's non-stationarity associated with the climate now. And we can't use the past to predict the future. It's a totally different game now. Next slide, please. So what would this framework for climate resiliency be? And this gets into the definition and explanation of need. In 2021, the Army Corps, GS, and NOAA developed this proposal that's now been funded within Focus Area 5 to anticipate future changes in Great Lakes weather patterns and potential risks. So we see this as a very useful template to draw from rather than recreating the wheel. Next slide, please, or next animation. And then the goal of this framework for resilient investments basically looks at 5 different areas: forecasts of hydrologic uncertainty and the future lake levels, ice cover, forecasts of wave and surge intensity, estimates of sediment movement along the littoral zones, the nearshore zones, and then also coastal change assessment, identifying the most vulnerable areas to erosion and sediment accretion. So this seems like a good framework for us to be building upon. Next slide, please. And then we were asked to look at the deficiencies in the Action Plan 3. And the reality is that Action Plan 3 basically ignores climate change. The only reference was in a definition of project sustainability, and the working definition of resilience suggests the intent to maintain existing conditions. And we're, again, getting to the point of non-stationarity. We don't feel like this is the appropriate approach with respect to climate change, because maintaining existing conditions is just not going to happen given the dynamic nature of future weather conditions, which we're seeing right now. Next animation, please. And then this commitment to adaptive management, which also Kyle and Sylvia touched upon. We need to have innovative and resilient project designs combined again with this notion of a long-term commitment where the resources are available to allow us to actually implement adaptive management. Because again, these projects don't always behave according to plan. Next slide, please. And again, like the DIJA group did, we looked at new approaches based on focus area by focus area. Next animation. And so although we evaluate each of these 5 focus areas separately, we do want to recognize the fact that many of these issues are cross-cutting amongst all of the 5 focus areas. And therefore, we strongly recommend that the EPA consider these cross-cutting issues and look at it from an integrated perspective, even though our recommendations are focus area by focus area. So with toxic substances and AOCs, we first recommend that climate resilience and adaptation take place as early as possible within the project stage, ideally during the feasibility and design stages, and be built in also into the RFPs. Secondly, rather than incorporating climate resiliency at the AOC level, which may be impractical, we're recommending that it be done at the BUI level. And we'll talk a little more about that, which allows for more specificity, because the climate resilience aspect is driven more by certain BUIs than others. So we don't want to get bogged down in a BUI that really doesn't lend itself to the climate resiliency question. Let's focus on those BUIs that really are most targeted for climate resilience. And then finally, with respect to chemicals of concern, we strongly recommend that we take an ecosystem approach, which allows climate resilience to be built into this, because of climate, we're going to see more impacts with respect to temperature, which will change the kinetics of these chemicals, and also potentially transportation or transport through the system. Storm events, which are much more intense now, will have greater erosive power. and therefore liberate more sediments, which might be containing these chemicals of concern. Next slide. With respect to invasive species, we recommend that the models that are being built to identify where these invasive species may be coming from, may be entering, and where they might be moving, also include now changes in extremes in temperature. So we know what their thermal, so we're modeling what their thermal tolerances are. And also that also relates to dissolved oxygen and the chemical liberation we're talking about, because again, based on the kinetics, those chemicals may become more liberated under changing temperature conditions. So that when we're looking at these potential candidate species for invasion and their spread within the systems, we're looking at it in a more holistic way. Next, please. With respect to focus area 3, non-point source pollution, impacts on nearshore health, we're recommending, we're looking at it from these 3 different perspectives: from agriculture, from stormwater, and also from non-point source control and refined management efforts. So next slide, please. This will allow us to have this long-term maintenance and evaluation to ensure performance longevity, again, because there's a very strong probability that the weather pattern changes will outpace the time frame for project design. And this is something we emphasized in the last report as well. So this is continuing on the nearshore health, this resiliency needs to be built into the design and implementation of the future urban stormwater management projects, so that we can reduce these stressors. And as we've noted elsewhere, it's critical to incorporate social and equity considerations into these projects so that the benefits are proportionally distributed throughout the entire region. Next, please. And then finally, we want to modify the current design standards to ensure this project on longevity and resilience. And this would include establishing these multi-agency coordinated long-term maintenance and evaluation programs to ensure that the revised design standards are effective. So it's much more than just EPA. Again, it gets into the regional working group. For habitat and species, again, you'll see a little bit of redundancy here. We're recommending that we follow the landscape conservation design principles, which have already established a portfolio of protection programs and projects that are focused on these anticipated future conditions. Again, not trying to rebuild the wheel again. Next animation, please. So with that in mind, we're recommending that Focus Area 4 should invest in the development and application of these regional models that have a twofold purpose. One, explore how these benefits across a range of climate regimes provide a broad suite of conservation and ecosystem services, and then also encourage innovative nature-based designs that address the needs of these habitats and species across changing climate regimes. Next, please. As we continue habitat and species, given the dynamic nature of these anticipated changes, it's recommended that the projects be designed and constructed to address the full range of potential habitat benefits. And again, this gets into this kind of scenarios modeled across a suite of different conditions, and that we not use what was done in the past to anticipate the future. Next animation, please. And therefore, appropriate monitoring criteria and performance metrics need to be identified during the concept and design phases that take into account this dynamic nature of climate change into the future. Next slide, please. And continuing along that, again, reflecting these for adaptively managing the habitats and ecosystems, we need to take into account the changing climate and the related stressors. Again, the climate doesn't operate in isolation. It's impacting a lot of different things. And these interactions need to be addressed as well. And these management principles need to be applied across individual sites at local and regional scales, and then also at larger, broader scales to maintain the essential ecosystem functions and services to the system. And that, again, reflecting on what we've recommended in previous reports, we need to fund long-term monitoring and maintenance of these projects so that as these changes occur, we make sure that the projects are being designed and built to serve their ultimate purpose. Next slide, please. And then encourage and support the development of these adaptive regulatory programs at all levels to incorporate these flexible review criteria and outcomes in response to this changing climate animation. And then incorporate and promote that nature-based engineering with, again, as much as possible, natural design approaches. We know from the high water level, Great Lakes water levels, that putting in built structures don't work. In fact, they usually exacerbate problems down lake, and that we need to use traditional ecological knowledge to address habitat, species, and broader scale environmental issues, rather than reflecting on these traditional gray or mechanical infrastructure that requires active management, intervention, and often have very high costs and don't adapt to climate well. Next, please. And then in the final focus area, foundations for future restoration actions, we're recommending emphasis and funding for projects that address not just the physical and biological and chemical aspects of climate change, but also the human social infrastructure in the Great Lakes region. And this applies to all elements of our populations, with special emphasis made to address the climate and racial justice issues that are being impacted disproportionately by increasing impacts on their physical and social environments in less developed, disadvantaged, and underserved neighborhoods and rural areas. Next slide. Participating agencies should have assigned personnel and liaisons that are co-located within GLMPO offices. And this gets back to Sylvia's recommendation to better facilitate timely coordination, and perhaps consider giving the senior GLMPO staff the authority to prioritize work activities of cooperating agency personnel who've been charged with assisting GLMPO-led initiatives. This not only builds on better information exchange, which Sylvia alluded to, but also by providing greater authority downstream, it will actually facilitate and expedite the kinds of changes that are necessary and that we're talking about today. Next, please. And then finally, for the education programs that are funded under Focus Area 5, we strongly recommend that there be hands-on experiential learning elements to complement the typical classroom curricula. This also reflects back on what Kyle said about some of the meetings that we have with the community. Rather than us talking and lecturing to the audience, wherever we can build in this kind of hands-on learning experience, I think it's going to have a much greater impact and also leave a greater legacy with the community that we're interacting with. Next slide. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Scudder and our work group to please provide any things that I might have misrepresented, or that need to be reflected upon.
Thank you, Al. Any comments from the Great Lakes Advisory Board members? One comment I will make is BUI means beneficial use impairment. For those who are not familiar with the AOC lingo, I had to make that.
I did say it, Scudder. I said it out.
Well, I don't know. You okay.
And Scudder, I will say we heard a news anchor from the city of Cleveland do a BUI 101 on the local 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock news, which we thought was pretty darn cool.
If you're talking about Betsy Kling, that's because we've had a relationship with her for years.
Well, thank you, Kyle. I greatly appreciate that.
Just in case nobody in the listening audience or attending the meeting understood what a BUI was. So I didn't hear you actually say it outright, Al, but that's okay.
Well, a meeting wouldn't be complete, Scudder, if you didn't criticize me about something.
Oh, come on. Sylvia, maybe you can extract me from this difficulty I currently find myself in. So.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to make it any easier, but I think one of the things that would be particularly helpful is to really understand how you all were defining like climate resiliency, because it's different in what I would suggest are like movement spaces, right? Where a lot of youth engaged folks, other scientists that are really trying to make connections between how it is that there's got to be a way to also address heat trapping emissions, right? For instance, and trying to understand how you all thought through that, because it feels like it's something lacking here in terms of the description of what climate change is looking like. There's also a matter of, I've heard Frank, and in fact, you were one of the persons that really sort of opened my eyes up on this more when we had some conversations back in the last charge that we did for AP3 was around migration, right? And the impacts of that on climate and environment and what we need to think about regarding climate change in other communities that's driving migration to the Great Lakes, right? And what that means for industry and even the whole conversation we're having here around resiliency. And then lastly is also how it is that you are really thinking through the inclusion of I would say younger generations that are very much helping to drive these conversations and are, I would suggest, are not going to be happy with these recommendations that don't tackle climate change in the Great Lakes in the ways that I believe they've been trying to bring greater attention to. And so I guess I'm just wondering like how you all thought through some of that. Thank you.
Well, I didn't get into the specific definition because we actually put it within mitigation and adaptation as well. But the definition that we have is practice of including resiliency in design of systems, recognizing the impacts of climate change often cannot be anticipated to the level of detail necessary for final design. So the notion here, and taking it out of context is not going to answer your question directly, because it's part of a larger context within the report, which is why I didn't get into it, because I thought that we would end up in a very detailed conversation and end up reciting the entire report that we wrote. But we had a long discussion about the definition. We felt like we did not need another definition, so we tried to reflect on what's already been done and also have a definition that was consistent with our recommendations. And that's where that definition comes from. But it is part of a larger narrative that we have in the report in terms of it. But it's really meant as an operating definition.
Sylvia, from an engineering design sort of standpoint, my takeaway from resiliency is that you design something that may anticipate different conditions than historic conditions and can function as intended under perhaps a wider range of scenarios and provide the service or the functionality that you'd like to achieve under a wider range of scenarios. And B is that perhaps it can't provide the exact specific target functionality that you wanted, maybe species specific, for instance, but that it provides some good in a beneficial use context, if not directly as designed, but maybe a plan B, if you will. So that's how I think of resiliency in those two efforts or those two contexts. It's not my job to address policy that is someday going to slow or alter, and probably reverse is out of the question, the impacts of what we've already done from an anthropogenic input into the environment.
Brent, your hand is raised.
Yeah, I mean, I would part of in my mind, what the resiliency here is that it's the capacity to adapt to and to deal with the uncertainties of change. And climate change certainly is one of those that's causing us that problem. And it's causing it in local levels in terms of the communities and in some very physical, direct program ways. But it's also causing it in terms of affecting our means of governance in small towns and in areas that are affected by this, in environmental justice communities and the tribal communities, that the strains that are there, our systems usually are not set up to deal with this kind of change. So resiliency to me is building that capacity to deal with that change. And that's when I talked about wanting to be sure that we covered social issues in this, that because you know, a local planning commission, for instance, at a local government may be faced with some really tough decisions, but need to be addressing them through a different lens than they have always looked at. I think what Alan, when you in part of our statement, you say that the past does not adequately predict the future. I think that we need to think about that, and in climate change, this is becoming increasingly true. And so that's why I was thinking of how do we make sure that we have the social infrastructure in terms of governments and organizations and things to help our communities deal with the climate. And to me, that's a big part of the resiliency issue that we need to face. That's why this has been a big part of my concern for a long time. The concern over climate migration was one of those sort of is affected by that as well. So anyway, that's just some additional thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, one comment I would make is for Sylvia as well. This climate, you know, there are two sides of that coin. There's a mitigation side and there's an adaptation side. And the mitigation side is, I think, is what you may have been referring to, and that would be the reduction in emissions, the carbon, methane emissions and things of this sort. And then the adaptation side, which is, I think, more of what we focused on in part, is how do you respond to these changes, recognizing that some of these changes, may not be completely reversible. And I think that's what John was alluding to. I would say that in terms of some of the work that we're doing, and I know I'll speak to Ohio and our H2 Ohio program, we're investing in wetlands, coastal wetlands and inland wetlands. And wetlands are carbon sinks in many cases. They trap and store carbon coming through the system. So as we look at some of the metrics and some of the things we're trying to accomplish, we're looking at nutrient reduction, we're looking at water quality improvement, but we're also now starting to measure and account for the amount of carbon that we may be sequestering. And there are other related things that can be done, but they are a bit outside the purview at this time of, I think, what the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, at least the focus areas, as I see them in terms of environmental, the environmental restoration protection. I certainly agree that carbon emissions, we need to address those as best we can. And I think in terms of some of the projects that we invest in, that's certainly a consideration. And maybe perhaps would be some of the metrics that we may need to consider. So I think that's, I just wanted to sort of clarify that. And I think that also guided some of our thinking as well in terms of the recommendations that we made, because they are aligned with the Action Plan 3 framework and structure. And maybe there needs to be an additional focus area or some other emphasis that may be related more on the carbon cycle and the carbon sequestration. There are a series of major research efforts ongoing now looking at carbon cycling between the land and the lakes, the Compass Project specifically. So,
Sylvia, what did you have in mind with respect to trying to make this more approachable to the youth?
I think it in some ways it ties back to the other charge questions, but there really is a climate justice aspect to this, right? That's related to the environmental justice issues, but that I didn't necessarily hear you all name specifically. And especially when people are talking about not just the impacts now or what they're trying to adapt to, right? To protect against the threats that exist, but also how this is going to be playing out over the next few generations, right? Many of which is part of, indigenous practices and thinking several generations forward. And I think the frustration that what I'm anticipating, right? And just in like conversations I'm having with other folks in other places, is that if these are the recommendations, they're still not getting at enough of what younger folks are feeling needs to be a more urgent approach to mitigate the issues here in the Great Lakes based on the priorities that they're talking about, right? So a lot of those are around carbon, how it is that there is a way to build in more green energy. I understand like a lot of the recommendations also have to do with what might be, some of the models that need to be developed. But I think that what I would suggest is that a lot of the ways that we're moving now isn't happening at enough of a quick pace or enough of a change in the direction of how we've been moving to be able to address this in a quicker timeline, and that actually brings in more of the perspectives of folks that are calling for greater urgency, right? And so in some ways, I appreciate like all of what you all have put forward, but I feel like there's a significant voice and perspective that's still missing from the current generation of climate justice folks that I'm concerned or would be critical to these recommendations, right? And so this is again like where spaces like the public comments that we're going to have today matter, and other ways for folks to be able to give feedback on what it is we've been developing so far from this board. But I think that it's something we need to be very sensitive to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Al and Sylvia, it's Larry. I think one of the things I'm hearing is possibly the need for a new focus area. Because the charges that we've had and the things that we're looking at, sediment and nutrient transport. Whereas if we're trying to, say, capture carbon, there are many practices that can and will reduce sediment and nutrients and also capture carbon from an ag perspective. But there's all other opportunities too. So right now, we don't have a specific focus area looking at possibly, and I don't want to get into the cause of climate change or climate modifications, but that's essentially what I think you're looking at, Sylvia, and trying to wrap your arms around is how can we capture that component, and we may not be able to adequately do that without a new recommendation for a new focus area in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative.
Well, Larry, that's a good point, and it gets back to what Scudder said. Our focus was more on adaptation than mitigation. Geoengineering is very expensive. I mean, really expensive, and there's certainly some, startups that are looking at this right now and being implemented across the world. But there's probably some relatively less expensive geoengineering ideas that could be implemented, or at least there could be a focus area that is asking for ideas around this that could be implemented in a more rational way in the Great Lakes. Whether it's different types of green energy, renewable energy production, or whether it's actually carbon capture systems. That's an interesting idea.
This is Frank, and I wanted to add to this that there are other things as well that affect the Great Lakes, that could in reducing, for instance, in encouraging bicycle travel in urban areas and in areas where we have larger populations, including there's a number of different things we can do that individuals can do that affect the larger picture, even though they're not the big programs, and you can get people involved individually where they're feeling that they're doing something towards the bigger issues. So the idea of how does this, for instance, relate for the Great Lakes? What ways can we reduce the pollution that hits the lakes? What ways can we do to protect the lakes that also are things that individuals can do on an individual basis, and participation. One of the things that we do recommend is funding for indigenous and environmental populations, environmental justice populations, to help fund representatives to attend meetings or to fund meetings that happen in these areas. So we get more engagement and input from individuals. The other one that we talked about is the idea about working with the concept of working in the schools. Many organizations have, I just was at a Sturgeon meeting and we had this, they have the Sturgeon in the classroom programs where each classrooms are given a sturgeon and they raise that sturgeon, they name it, and then they get a chance to put that back in the river someday. And these are what the kids get really involved in. This has been a very successful program dealing directly with the lakes, dealing directly with the water. They've shown that when the water is clear, the sturgeon grows. When the water gets polluted, the sturgeon stops growing. These are things that the kids can see themselves in the classroom. This is a way to engage youth throughout the state in programs that deal with water quality and the Great Lakes, and also are engaging people at that individual level. So I think these are some of the things that are part of what our overall plan needs to be. I like the idea of having perhaps another point to raise and hear as we make our final recommendations. But so I'll end there. Thanks.
Todd, you got your hand raised?
Sorry.
Is that
about
your dog?
Yeah, he wanted to join the call. Apologize. So, I just want to remind the board members that the GLRI, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, is a non-regulatory program. So there are things that we can do and there are things that we can't do. And, so to the degree that the board wants to begin, to the degree that the board wants to make a recommendation related to mitigation, I would ask the board, how do you prioritize that with everything else that we are doing, especially given perspectives, so that we are best able to sort of act and consider the recommendations of.
Yeah, Todd, we sort of lost you there. Did you just fall? Oh, there you are. You just flipped over to the other side. You cut out a bit, at least for me.
Okay, I apologize. My son is home with COVID, so he's bothering me right now.
Okay. That's fine.
So Scudder, what I was just trying to say is that if the board is considering, a recommendation related to mitigation, that you just sort of, one, make sure that you recognize the GLRI as a non-regulatory program. There are things we can do. There are things that we can't do. And if that is going to be a recommendation, think through how that gets prioritized across all the different activities that we do in GLRI. I know there are a lot of initiatives right now on carbon capture and things of that nature. And some of the news stories I've seen, these are big dollar figures, well higher than any of our annual appropriations that we get with GLRI. So, I wouldn't want to have expectations put out there, in the public that the GLRI could do something that we may not ultimately have, either resources and or the authority to do.
Yep. Understood. Yep. I think that, part of the discussion, the way I was looking at this just briefly in terms of the discussion would be for the projects that we do invest in that do have carbon sequestration, have mitigation benefits, that may be a metric or an additional measure of success in terms of contributing toward that goal. It's just something to consider. It may be a recommendation. Obviously, the recommendations are draft. That's the reason we're having this meeting, is to have this discussion. Bring up these items that perhaps we haven't considered, or we have, and maybe we've gone down a somewhat different path. But this is certainly something that the work group and perhaps the GLAD as a whole we can discuss as well as we put together and finalize this final report. John, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, Yes, you said about 70% of what I, about what I
Yeah,
wanted to
okay, John, yeah,
say.
finish the
Typical,
30%.
typical. But in addition, maybe there's a component for considering grant applications that if there is a mitigation component, that would be recognized in scoring or competition for the grant dollars.
Yep, Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think, I'm not sure, I guess, like right now, like what we're doing by way of trying to provide specifics around some of the recommendations. I guess I'm really thinking that there really is a lot of literature out there around all of the issues connected with climate resilience, mitigation, adaptation, and how that's being tied into climate justice. And I know that wasn't specific to what was named in the charge questions, but it ties in very much with like the issues around what we've had in the general questions around environmental justice and impacted communities, right? And so the issue too that very much is tied in with this is also the matter of heat, right? And how the Great Lakes are warming up, and that the impact on environments, aquatic life, and on and on and on, right? And so, trying to see like how the recommendations that we're making are tying in with those concerns and where it is that people are living, or what is happening to wild rice, or what is happening to other native species. And so I guess I'm trying to figure like where we're creating the space for the additional recommendations that tie in with some of those things that are part of the youth focused, and again have the relationship to other things that we've talked about both in the last charge and in this one, that also tie in with where resources are going and who's getting the funding to even help with being able to think differently about like even, well, how to say it, like sectors, the tie-ins with energy sectors, the tie-ins with workforce development initiatives. Yes, education programs are great and always want to get to as many young people as possible, kids, and so they can see the relationship with caring for a sturgeon, right? And the life after they're no longer in the care of that. But there are a lot of other folks, especially in again, these younger generations, that are really saying that, look, with the existing resources, with the ways in which we're building models and the ways in which we're setting priorities, there has to be more emphasis on the fears that people are having now with the ways in which we're utilizing resources, right? And I hear you, Todd, that this isn't so much about, and I hear the concerns about we can't do anything that's in a regulatory set of recommendations. And I don't think that I'm suggesting that, but I think that as a GLAB, we have a greater responsibility to talk more about the concerns that folks that are working in the climate justice space are seeing are important, that get beyond, again, some of the more science-based stuff that I think comes out of our recommendations that shows, look,
yes,
we're hearing the larger audience of people that live in the Great Lakes communities, what they're experiencing, and maybe at least figuring out how it is that we can expand on the questions and recommendations. And so I guess maybe trying to figure out where's the space for that after this meeting. Thanks.
Yep. Sylvia, just to in part answer your question, and then I'll go to Frank. And I don't have an answer for the question per se, but we do have another half hour allocated basically to talk about the synergies and the implementation strategies as a GLAB. And I think the space that you're looking for may be in that discussion that we're going to move into very quickly. And that would be, a number of us have been thinking about how do we integrate the climate resiliency recommendations with the recommendations that you have, where we apply those climate resiliency principles, to the environmental justice principles. Where do we integrate the two approaches so that the investments that GLRI makes are addressing not only some of the climate resiliency needs, the temperature needs, but also the needs of an underserved community, or however you want to define that community. And I think we have space for that. And that's, I think, the final, not the final, but an additional section in our report, which in part the discussion that we have coming up today will help guide us in terms of what we put there. And we would certainly anticipate your engagement in those discussions as well, to keep us on track and to make sure that we are at least trying to address, those concerns.
I'm hoping I can be parked. I'm hoping I can be parked and just linger outside the school by the time
Nicole, if you could mute yourself, that would be most helpful. Thank you. Frank, please.
Yes, and Sylvia said quite a bit of what I was going to say in a way, but what I'm thinking is that there's quite a lag time from the time the charge questions are put together and presented to us, the time we go through and look at them, and the time our recommendations get put in, and then before they can get implemented. And at this time of the changing climate, that's a long time right now. Many things may come up during that time period that weren't necessarily anticipated in those charge questions. And I think that's part of our job is not only to just answer the questions as they're presented, but if there's something that goes beyond, I think it's important for us to note that in our recommendations in our report, that there are things that may go beyond where we currently are in those current questions, just to help inform perhaps the next set of questions. And so I don't think that, not that I want to be a regulatory agency or get, this is partly in response to Todd, but there are things that we might recommend that could be done that we should be thinking about, and we shouldn't be afraid to make those kind of statements. Thank you.
And so Frank and Sylvia, point well taken. Not trying to stifle any of the recommendations. It was more of just, I heard commentary about creating a 6 focus area or creating, new initiatives. And, to the degree we create new stuff, there's somewhat of a zero-sum game. I think the board is well within your parameters to provide any recommendation you want. I think what I was going towards more of a prioritization. And I know the last time the board provided recommendations, it was sort of short-term, medium-term, long-term, with some of those, more lofty recommendations being long-term. I'm not saying they necessarily need to be set up in the same way, but if there are some, Frank, as you pointed out, things that are, that we want to just sort of put a marker down or at least voice a concern about, that is well within the board's parameters. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do believe our intent is to review the recommendations and try to prioritize them within some sort of a time frame like we did in the last cycle. And I think that may in part address that issue. But I do think that we can perhaps reach beyond our initial boundaries a bit and make those suggestions. And I think that, we'll have some additional discussions internally about how that may be amongst the work group. So I think that would be very, very helpful. Yeah. Any other comments at this point on the climate resilience recommendations from anyone? Nope. Okay, if you want to move to the next slide, this is where we're going to have some more opportunity for discussion amongst the GLAB. We probably have about maybe 20 minutes or so if we want to stay on schedule here. And, we can go a little longer or shorter as need be. And then we do have 3 individuals who have requested time to provide oral comments as well. And we'll get to that after we can finish this next round of discussion amongst the GLAB. So, and really what we'd like to do, and we've started going down this path, is, as we have talked, is how do we integrate the recommendations from the climate resiliency group with the stakeholder engagement, but even more so with the DEIJA work group recommendations? Are there areas of overlap? Are there examples that we can provide? And EPA has asked for examples in a number of the different focus areas, but maybe even beyond that, where they can, GLRI or their federal partners can make investments in projects that have environmental justice benefits, but also have climate resiliency benefits. And there are a couple different steps that, at least in the climate group, we had identified as it's identifying and thinking about those opportunities. It's then how do you solicit projects that have those types of attributes to them that meet more than just one specific type of parameter. What would be the review and evaluation criteria of that? How would you evaluate that? What are the metrics that you use? And then again, always throughout all of this, for both of these, we need to monitor and adaptively manage as conditions change. And I think that applies in the DEIJ sphere. I think that came across in their recommendations. And I also think it comes across very strongly in the climate resiliency recommendations. And so I would open up the floor for some discussion along these lines. I know Larry Antosh, I don't know if you want to start off with your heat island concept that we've shared and discussed in the past, but there may be other ideas and examples that we could bring forward, and looking for any input you may have and what you would like to discuss. So the floor is open.
Scott, I'd be happy to talk about the heat island aspect. One of the things that I know the city of Columbus did here a couple of years ago was do a analysis of heat islands within the city. And as we're looking at the changing weather patterns, and as we're looking at developing green infrastructure for stormwater, creating vegetative areas that could be a cooling spot for those in the community that don't have a park or being impacted by the rising temperatures in the summer, might, you could kind of do a dual purpose design where you're creating green infrastructure for stormwater, but then also creating an urban cooling area for those communities that may not have that opportunity because of the urban heat island impacts. So again, just looking at some synergies between two types of projects that deal with actually two aspects of almost opposite aspects of some of our changing weather patterns.
Yeah, I think this is one example that we found to be particularly interesting when we had our climate resiliency discussions. I just have a request. During this discussion, could all of the board members turn on their cameras so we can see who we're speaking with? Maybe I'll make the exception of Al, but we'll see. Thank you, Larry. Yeah, I have to widen my screen here as well. So very good. Are there any other examples that people can think of, or any thoughts? One of the things that I'll just throw something out in terms of the review and evaluation criteria that we need to consider. I think that the criteria perhaps need to be a bit more flexible than they have been historically within GLRI. They are tied to metrics, and that also means that the metrics that we had to measure success or progress needs to be broader as well. And there has to be some way that when projects are evaluated, they're not evaluated or siloed by a specific, because you have a specific metric that's measuring this, is that when we evaluate, when the reviewers evaluate proposals for projects, that we need to look at the broader benefit whether in this case, I'm thinking about, let's say, an environmental justice benefit along with a climate resilience benefit. I'm not sure that the GLRI system is set up necessarily in terms of how they establish their criteria. I don't think they have thought about how they combine those together. And I may get a comment back from Todd on that. But that would be one of the things that we could recommend in terms of an implementation strategy is how do we modify the evaluation and the review criteria and or that process to ensure that we get projects that provide multiple benefits for the dollars that are invested rather than just a single benefit because of the way the metrics are established to evaluate progress within GLRI. I'll go with John Hull and then back to Sylvia.
Thanks, Cutter. So one of the things I'm always an advocate of is not just having the metrics, but having the funding going forward post-construction for active management of whatever you're building. I know we like to engineer with nature, and we like to have passive systems that seem more natural as much as we can. But sometimes you don't get the flexibility or the great return on your capital investment if you don't have some ongoing active management. And part of that management is monitoring of performance, gathering metrics to compare to your target metrics, if you will, for whatever you're trying to do. That's how we all learn and grow and improve things for the next time around. So why can't we make part of that metrics collection or performance monitoring be integrated with education and community outreach? Bring the impacted communities into that process. Don't leave it all to the professionals. I mean, we love to do that kind of stuff, and everybody likes to go out and do the field work, whether it's a NGO or a public entity or a consulting company like I work for. We love to get out and do the field and the monitoring. Let's make a concerted effort to engage the community that is most impacted or that we want to try to bring not up to speed, but just more informed, more involved. There's nothing like the example of growing the sturgeon in the classroom. But let's provide some funding and means to keep the environmental justice community engaged in the monitoring and maybe the management of the long-term performance of what we built to respond to the beneficial use impairments.
Thanks, John. Sylvia.
Thanks for that, John. I definitely like where you and Scudder are going with this. I think it's definitely opening up more of the avenues that we need. I would share though that I think where I'm still kind of concerned that I'm hearing is folks talking about principles. And I think even Todd, what you're referencing about what could be perceived as a zero-sum game, right? And I think that gets at part of the problem about where there are new opportunities, where there are new entry points, right? If we assume that what exists now deserves to exist and continue, right? And so then, yes, there is no opportunity for something new, different approaches, different communities, different data points, right? And so I guess I'm looking more for moving beyond principles, and yes, those are always important to name, but moving towards priorities that are attached to resources. And so using that sort of framework instead to help with the determination around what are the evaluation criteria that need to be changed, right? And so again, going back to what you're saying, the incorporation of things that are not already part of what an applicant is required to do, or I can just tell you as a community-based member, I don't even know where to be able to figure out where evaluation information is available, right? If I want to see what someone else did to apply for funding and how it was determined or assessed if they were successful, especially if they're a group in my community, and I'm wondering, like, what funding did you get and what did you do with it, and how do I know what impact you had or who you were working with, right? And I can tell you that, like, groups that I'm familiar with already that are getting funding, many of those same people don't even live in the community, right? They're folks that are doing good, admirable work, but they're not residents here. They live outside the city, and they're involved in projects that are meaningful to them, that have environmental, ecological benefits that people in the city can certainly benefit from, but they're disproportionately not residents and disproportionately receiving benefits that could be done in a different way, right? If there was more inclusivity. And it gets at what we're talking about in terms of how it is that we're not doing better around the engagement, but also better around the distribution and allocation of the resources, right? And so it's a bit of the walking the talk. And so I guess I'm trying to understand, like, for one, like, how we better make more transparent and available the information around where funding is going, so that we can have a more community-based understanding of that, or at least for the folks that have not been at the table, right? Not been at the beneficiaries of those resources, and how it is that we build in a more inclusionary space for that, without it being necessarily a zero sum, or as a way to actually just be more inclusive. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Frank?
All right, I had to unmute myself. Yes. I'm going to go back to the sturgeon for a minute here. And I just attended the sturgeon release program that was run by Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in Wolverine, Michigan. They're working in conjunction with the Black Lake Sturgeon Rearing Facility, the Sturgeon for Tomorrow, and MSU. And they're further to the east of there. At the Black Lake facility, they did a sturgeon release a couple of weeks ago, where they take the sturgeon to the river and they release them in the river, and they have kids actually do that work, do the releasing. So you've got kids doing it. There's a sign there mentioning some of where their funding comes from. And that's one thing. For the tribe, just this last Saturday, we had over 100 people there, both tribal members and non-tribal members, half of whom were kids. And all of them got a chance to release a sturgeon into the river themselves from their own hand. And there was a poster board there that had 15 different projects that the tribal hatchery was working on. And of those, GLRI was mentioned in the funding and on the poster about 5 or 6 times, and was mentioned by the director to the adults in the area. So there was an immediate thing with both the general population youth, and also with the tribal youth and tribal citizens, in this direct relationship to the lake, to the river, to the waters of the Great Lakes. And GLRI is definitely part of it. So there's a way to do that, but we need to have projects like this that engage this. Not only are those sturgeon raised here, but they're taken to Saginaw Bay and down to the St. Clair River as well. And so there are releases that happen in those locations that are somewhat similar to what we're doing up in northern Michigan, all from the same sturgeon rearing facility up there on the Black River, right up by Black Lake. This is an example of the GLRI being out there and being in the public eye, and something that directly deals with the next generation of people, the kids, and also lets the community as a whole know what's going on and what kind of things are happening in terms of programs. I think these are good models of ways that people can be engaged. And I think that we should, keep that in mind as we think about what we're doing here. Thank you.
Yep. This goes back to the reciprocity comment earlier, where there needs to be something coming back from US EPA and the federal partners in terms of the projects that they invest with and connect with those local communities to say, hey, we are making a difference. This is what is happening. This is how it's benefiting you. And hopefully that the local communities will see how it may benefit them as well. And I think Frank has an excellent example, and I think that needs to be done much more broadly across the basin. Laura, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think what's been presented has been very helpful and has a lot of thought that's gone into it. I think what I'm hearing now in this sort of discussion or conversation section is the one last piece that I think would be very helpful are these examples of GLRI projects that encapsulate some of what we are talking about with climate resiliency and DEIJ. And, one of the things that was heartening for me when I went to the public engagement session in Milwaukee is going around the outside of the room at the end and talking to some of the staff. They had really exciting examples. One of them talked to me about workforce and some workforce development projects that they were doing. Somebody else talked about education. Somebody else talked about engagement. I think we have examples within the GLRI program that touch on some of these points that we are trying to advocate for and see more of. And I think one of the effective things that we could do is highlight those stories in our reports and try to pull out the important points or criteria or components that we think that the EPA and the other agencies should continue going forward or place greater emphasis going forward. And, so whether it's Frank's example where you're talking about, tribal engagement, tribal agency that the tribal government has, youth education, or some of the other examples that we have, these are, to me, illustrative of the recommendations that we're making. And I think bring to life sort of what we're talking about and what we'd like to see more of in the GLRI program. So that's just where I think we could go next in terms of wrapping up this work.
Understood. You just made me think about, in the action plans, they set these goals, where a number of acres of wetlands is restored or things of that sort. And just producing a graph or a plot is not terribly exciting, is it? Maybe if you're an engineer like John here, maybe he's excited about that. And, I have a degree of excitement about that as well. But I think what you're saying is that we need to show these and demonstrate these successes in a different way. The targets and goals that are set are things that are basically done so that you can go back to Congress and say, hey, look at what we've done. Look at you've basically some sort of quantification of the success. But I wonder if what you're talking about is actually a much more powerful way to demonstrate success, where those local constituents feel the benefit of what's been done, of the investments that have been made, and how this has benefited their community, and that coming up through the more political side of things that drive some of the funding is also a very powerful mechanism to make sure that we continue doing this good work. It's just a thought, and I think your point is well taken. If anybody else has additional comments or suggestions, more than willing to hear what other GLAB members may want to say about this.
Scudder, I don't think it's necessarily a matter of whether it's a better way to present than target it, but it's a different way, and both of them have equal validity. I wouldn't necessarily target one over another.
Yeah, thanks for that, Al. And I'm not, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but there may be different ways of saying the same thing to highlight the success. So I'll pull back a little bit on that one. So that's all fine. Any other comments or suggestions at this time? John.
Yeah, you got me thinking a little bit. Every environmental program with GLRI or similar that I've been involved with, there's always a learning board that thanks the sponsors and talks a little bit about what's going on. But today with putting a QWERTY information button on there that people can use to read and get more information. That's a great way to automatically collect information going back about who's reading it and, you know, what are they getting out of it, and that's a metric that might be kind of interesting in the future. I'll stop because that's like all I know about it.
Okay. Any other comments at this time? Sylvia?
I don't really want to keep being the negative Nelly here, but I'm concerned that I'm still not hearing enough from this board that I think needs to be said more in terms of the greater inclusion of equity in the GLRI process, right? And so I think the examples you gave there, Frank, are excellent. And who would not love to support kids learning about sturgeon and having them released? And what a feel-good opportunity and example, right? But I'm still talking about that. I don't know enough, and clearly I'm no expert by way of how you all are. My role of even being on this board, or even why I applied, was really trying to figure out how to have a way that community-based groups could have a voice or a seat at the table for things that we see are still in some ways feeling inequitable, inadequate communication, inadequate access, and the past two charges that we've had to this board have really been a way to provide some insight and recommendations that could hopefully help move the needle, right? But I think what I'm feeling is that there still isn't enough equity and emphasis on that. We're not going to have a way to ensure that more communities are going to be not just engaged, but resourced, right? In ways that say, look, these two charges and what Glenn Poe is helping to lead across the work group for throughout the GLRI is now going to make a difference in the experiences of communities that didn't, for one, know about the GLRI, didn't know that resources could be provided to help them with longstanding problems that they've needed to have some sort of response to, and that we're operating differently than we've operated in the past, right? And I think that there's a lot of, and again, my opinion, I think there are a lot of people that are comfortable with the way things work because they've benefited from it, right? But I think that if we don't actually do something that has more teeth, that says there are a lot of people that have not benefited, will continue to not benefit, then I think that we're not living up to what we have been charged to do, right, in this administration. And so I'm wanting to hear again more talk beyond the principles that we agreed to, and a more a stronger response to say that, look, this business as usual has to be changed, right? We've got to have a way that we're ensuring that the work group, that Glenn Poe is going to help lead that work group to better have it so that communities that have not been engaged will be engaged in a certain number of engagements over the next few years, right? That the action plan public meetings are going to be designed differently, that the EJ program is going to be continued. If funding is not provided separately for that, there will be a way that the GLRI budget will incorporate that so that it continued to exist, right? There's got to be something that I guess I'm hearing from this GLAB making stronger recommendations to say that, look, we don't just agree, and yes, these are all nice things that we would like to see eventually somewhere, somehow, but that we're actually wanting to see metrics attached to them, right? And I'm concerned that, again, like, and you are all lovely people, but this is not a diverse board. This is an older board, and I want us to make sure that we're being generationally and racially and culturally more inclusive in how we think through these things based on the communities that we come from, right? So that we're giving voice to perspectives and people that we know are not at the table, and that is part of what we're really bringing in terms of the passion to the recommendations, right? So we're not just sort of like providing something that doesn't feel like we're inspired by or passionate about, right? And I don't feel that passion in this work right now. And I'm hoping you all will just really draw deeper from what I know you all are about, right? To say, yes, we can do more by way of how we even just word out the recommendations, right, in the final report. And so I guess I'm just looking for a little bit more of that from you all. So thank you.
Hey, are you going to tell us how to be? Go ahead.
Well, I have been a big fan of Sylvia's through these years on the GLAB, and have paid close attention to her role as the chair of the NEJAC as well. As difficult as it was to sometimes sit through 8 hours of meetings that she managed to do in a very professional, friendly, positive manner. And I share the frustration that Sylvia has been offering during the course of her comments. Sorry that you feel like Debbie Downer by yourself, but sometimes I'm afraid to open my old mouth. But right now I'm going to. I think that we have some really good suggestions put forward in the balance of our presentation here today. But there are a few things that, have frustrated me, and I've shared them with more than one of the GLAB members during the course of the past years. And that is, we're not really hearing from EPA what they are doing well as it relates to EJ. I can remember asking a question about the percent of EPA employees who have been through EJ training, and there wasn't a very encouraging response given to us. And I know that our focus is GLRI with regards to how to do a better job of engaging the impacted stakeholder groups that we are supposed to be focusing upon. But I'm a little frustrated because GLRI is about this big of everything that Region 5 does. And it's very frustrating to me that there hasn't been more of a give and take with the agency and all the other agencies engaged in the GLRI. We've not heard from any of the 16 partners that Todd mentioned earlier in his comments. And until he said that there were 16, I was like, wow, we probably should have had a conversation with a few of those or some input from them. But, while we've been going through this, all sorts of other funding opportunities have come forward with regards to the Great Lakes and the Tic Tacs and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm overwhelmed, and this is, quote, my job. So what are we expecting out of the communities that are being impacted? They've got to be just reeling from, if they're hearing it, reeling from this information overload. And one of my favorite sayings the past 18 months has been, we need to manage expectations. We have opportunity for improvements at so many different levels in our personal and professional lives, and in this role as a group of stakeholders surrounding all of the Great Lakes. And not that I offered you any answers, but I didn't want Sylvia to end today's meeting feeling like she wasn't being heard, because not only has she been heard, she's been greatly appreciated. And I look forward to hearing some responses from EPA in some of the items that we identified, that we wanted to hear how they've done past public engagements and how they have written up those summaries, and so that we can look to, use that as a basis for how they go forward with Action Plan 4 and what changes they're planning to put into play. We've not told them you have to, mail invitations to people. We didn't get to that level of nitty gritty, but we did say, what'd you do in 3, and show us what you're going to do and change to do 4. So I'm going to mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
And if the board wants, I know we're running a bit late either today or at a future board meeting. We can update the advisory board on how we've been incorporating the discussions of this board throughout the development of action plan for the public engagement aspect of it in particular. But the public engagement that we've done has been sort of the reaching out to the traditional stakeholders while still trying to do more to bring others in. But there's obviously lots more of opportunities for me for GLENPO and the other federal agencies to continue that engagement. And I think Kyle's comment from before is a very appropriate one. You develop the relationships now, so they're there when you need them. So I just wanted to, and I'll just stop with one final point. Our federal agencies have been engaged through this process. I think there are 6 or 7 that are participating in the YouTube live stream right now. We update them on a monthly basis on what is ongoing here and share all of the information that is being developed from this board with all of our federal partners, along with our state and tribal partners.
Okay, thank you, Todd. In the interest of time, I think we need to move on. Sylvia, thank you very much for your comments. Kay as well. Everybody who participated in this discussion. I think we do have more to consider and more to discuss as we pull together our final report. Well said. I think we need to move to the next phase on the agenda, and that is to receive public comments. We have 3 individuals who have registered in advance to provide oral comments. I believe we have 4 that have agreed to provide written comments. No, 3, sorry. And what I would like to do is just go down the list as I have them here. The first person is Laura Campbell, if she is available to provide public comment. You have, I believe, about 5 minutes, but we can go a little longer if necessary. So Laura, please provide your comments. I believe they'll be recorded and we'll be taking notes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Is everyone able to hear me okay?
Yes.
You are. Okay. So I want to first of all thank you very much for allowing the opportunity to provide public comments on this forum this afternoon. I thought the discussion was very interesting. And the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is a program that's been very important to us for a long time. I'm with Michigan Farm Bureau. You might think of me as something of a counterpart to Larry Antosh in Ohio, and I've worked with Larry for a long time. So I'm very glad he's on the board to bring the perspective of farmers to this project and to this committee. What I had intended to talk about today was really about the climate resiliency piece of the proposed recommendations. But hearing this discussion, I feel there's a lot of synergy between both ends of this discussion, both in the idea of how to engage communities, how to really effectively get feedback from the affected communities in the Great Lakes region, as well as how to address climate resiliency. And one of the key things that I have found in working with farmers, particularly around the area of climate change, is that there are a lot of farmers who, while acknowledging that climate change is a huge challenge for us, want to make sure that whether it's universities or federal agencies or any other groups that are working on improving environmental conditions, they want to make sure that those groups are not racing off to chase after the next thing. And I think that there's a huge opportunity in that, given that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is so focused and has been so focused on a range of concerns and practices and recommendations and projects that deal with water quality. And I'll dive a little bit here into the non-point source area of interest for the GLRI, noting that a lot of the practices that are recommended and a lot of the projects that are engaged on farmland and related to non-point source pollution prevention and reduction also have climate change benefits. If you look at the list from USDA, for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, what they put out as here's the practices we recommend that are climate smart agricultural practices. There is a huge amount of overlap between what's good for sequestering carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving efficiency is also good for water quality. Everything from managing your tillage to planting cover crops to, planting buffer strips to, engaging tree cover to, there's a long list of practices. And one of the most effective ways that we have found, and again, just speaking to farmers, in engaging those folks in thinking about climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation is to put it in the context of, hey, we're not asking you to do something new and shiny. This isn't some magic pixie dust that we're chasing after. We're asking you to do a lot of the same things that we've been pushing for a long time. These are good for not only water quality, but also soil health, your farm's bottom line. And look, they have climate change benefits too. So to that end, what I really wanted to make sure to get across to the committee, and again, appreciate all the work that you guys do, is that as you're putting these recommendations forward, and I do think that they're good recommendations, to make sure to take advantage of any opportunity to relate what you're proposing to do with what's out there, what's available. Hey, these existing programs do this. Hey, if you're concerned about other aspects of addressing problems in the Great Lakes, GLRI does these things, these other programs do these other things, and helping them to understand kind of where the intersection of those are. And then also, I really appreciated the recommendations to sort of meet people where they are and use the language and terminology that's familiar to them. Because I think sometimes people do, whether it's in urban communities, underserved communities, farming communities, folks feel lost when people use language and terminologies and discuss projects and discuss recommendations in a way that doesn't resonate with how they operate every day. So I very much appreciate that the recommendations do include that going forward, to say, hey, we not only have to make sure that we're making people aware of what's going on, what projects are available, how we're going to incorporate sort of this concept of resiliency and making sure that the work that we do to preserve the Great Lakes is able to stay in place and be sustainable over the long term, but also that we're going to be talking about it in a way that is familiar and uses the kind of terminology that the audience you're approaching is able to understand and able to incorporate into their own lives. So again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to make comments, and I'm hoping to be able to engage further in the process. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, for your comments. The next speaker is Nicole Bieber. If Nicole is online. Hi, Nicole. Please let us know your affiliation and feel free to speak. Share your thoughts. Not sure we can hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Ani, bonjour, Nicole Kiwe-Biber and Dijnaka, Wagana Casino Dawa, Nishna Begwe, Mishiki Dodem. I am a tribal citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa. I'm Turtle Clan, and I also work with Clean Water Action. So my comment, I'd like to begin talking a little bit about the environmental justice aspect and thinking about frontline communities, regarding environmental justice. There's that implicit fact of injustice that's happening with that. And really, there can't be more of this same, where corporate interests are sort of this untouchable baseline, where the main consideration, it seems like, continues to be economic rationale and like what's a rational thing, and this at a time when, you know, right before our eyes we're seeing all these escalating problems. So, you know, thinking about you know, the very good, well stated about going where people are, like show up where people already are, where grassroots activism, where people are demanding change. If you want to come to us and listen, I'm gonna uplift line 5 here. And the thing is, this is a triage situation in a lot of ways. And so for Detroit communities, you know, this is where the poison ends up. The fact that line 5 is there, in you know, what we say is the heart of the great turtle, in these very sacred waterways. You know, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say this is really terrorizing our indigenous nations 24/7, to go back to those numbers, right? That 24/7, 365. So that ongoing threat to our waters, to our lifeways, we need to think of that cumulative impact in terms of our mental health. And, you know, so when we think about the industrial runoff and going back to those corporate interests, it's just too much sway. And if that's not called out really emphatically, how can we get anywhere? So thinking about the chemicals of Roundup, and you have things like Monsanto and Bayer, thinking about big agriculture, and I want to uplift Laura, her buffer strips, that's music to my ears, right? And you have these small farmers and those communities that have been destroyed again by big agriculture, by all this runoff, and they were, you know, steadily poisoned. And of course, going back to oil, we have tar sands, we have fracking. So there's this need to really just stop doing the damage. And, you know, right now in New York City, we know right at the mouth of that St. Lawrence Seaway, the demand is no new oil projects. That will include no tunnel for line 5. And so what we need from you all, and to hopefully encourage the EPA to just really unapologetically prioritize safety and ending those threats. Biden can revoke the presidential permit for line 5. He can do that. He's not going to do it without pressure. He's not going to do it if scientists and you all don't really unapologetically, emphatically say, this is a danger, this is an emergency. We have the ice coming up. Enbridge has no plan for if that oil line breaks when there's ice. We know that storms are escalating unpredictably, intensively, quickly. So, you know, ending that threat that way, that's a real necessary foundation to pursue restoration. I would love to focus my energies on inviting our relatives home, thinking about the Numme, the sturgeon. This Saturday, I was doing a Monoman camp, rice camp with my daughters. That's all still threatened. As much as it uplifts us to see the restoration, I love the project you all do. I look at that website just to, you know, get a, you know, kind of like help my spirits. But, you know, that line breaking, it ended all. It ended any progress we had. And so, you know, thinking about that biodiversity crisis and this and that, and I just want to say the notion of a lack of familiarity, you know, with like what's going on with the restoration, to me, that kind of equates with the fact that we're in an emergency. And it's really hard to envision change and like dream the beautiful dream and make it happen when we're sort of at this point of like really acute anxiety. Sometimes I feel panic and the poison is still raining. So, you know, if we're thinking about health metrics, it makes me think of the notion of like, there's a comment earlier about human-centered. You know, that's not separate. That's not separate. Hey, hon, that's not separate from our interdependency with the animal nations, right? With the plants and the animal species and the insects that would be helped by those farmers' buffer zones, right? It's healing those wounds of that exploitation that's just at the root and still happening with these oil projects, with these present oil structures, you know. And so if we're looking at money, you know, maybe recommend like line 5 has to be shut down before that ice comes. And money to assure that just transition away from something like that. There's ways to make sure those UP communities can get through with the little bit of loss of the propane rather. You know, there's new ways to do this. Subsidize the cleanup, right? Subsidize the cleanup because they just want to leave their trash there. If they get kicked out, they don't have a plan to get rid of those things they put in our water. So, you know, thinking about the regreening and a notion of climate resistance, you know, to me that's a lot. That's that dream. That's everything. But in the New York Times today, there's an article on cooling cities, and it very much relies on the natural cycles and what those benefits are. But like I said, to have those things happen, we really need to stop the poison and stop the threat. And those need to happen at the same time, but in a lot of ways, they have to happen first. And it really needs to be adamant. It needs to be now. And it has to be said like it is necessary that we are not putting any bit of progress we have. All these past Great Lakes restoration, beautiful projects that bring communities together. It's unacceptable that line 5 and these other oil projects and all this industrial runoff are still rampant. We need to say it forthrightly and let it be that we can then turn our energies to focus on the restoration. I have lots of ideas. I have a beautiful dream, you know, for my children and all of your children and grandchildren, but it's really hard to do that when we're so scared. So, Miigwech, thank you so much, and I appreciate the time.
Yep. Thank you, Nicole. Drive safely. It looks like you're in a car. Thank you. Okay, we have one final individual who is would like to give oral comments, and this is Belinda Lee. Belinda, are you online?
And Scudder, I noticed that Belinda's not on the Zoom that we have. So perhaps Frank or Kurt knows anything further.
I did. Hi, Todd. I did email Belinda and did not get a response back.
Okay. She did indicate that she is also going to provide, would like to provide written comments. So hopefully if she can't participate and speak to us during this meeting, she can provide follow-on written comments. So for those who do wish to provide written comments, you can submit those to US EPA. They would go to John Hogland. I need to find his email address here, just a second. I believe it's Hogland, HAUGLAND .John, JOHN @EPA.gov. So feel free to provide your written comments, submit them electronically. John's giving a thumbs up because I think I have his email address memorized, which is really a scary thought, to tell you the truth. We have been corresponding a bit recently. So finally, I think that is all the folks that wanted to provide written comment. And I just want to give some acknowledgements, you know, thank you, US EPA, Chris Koroleski, Todd Medeshine, Megan Gavin, and John Hogland for their work with the GLAB, and, you know, we'll obviously continue that. We have some fantastic contractors that are working with us, Kurt Ali and Chris Rutsch, Frank Bajowski as well. Frank, nice job on doing the video and at least keeping a couple of us on Zoom, and which is good. And then within the GLAB, you know, Kyle and Al, really appreciate your ongoing work with the work groups and taking that as a leadership role. Of course, I think you were sort of appointed or elected. Laura, for all the input you provided with the Healing Our Waters Coalition, that served as a basis for many of the recommendations for the Environmental Justice Work Group. And Sylvia, I don't know what to say other than that your passion and your expertise and your enthusiasm for the topic is certainly shows through. It's been a learning experience, and we'll continue this learning experience as we pull this final report together. We'll have to have some discussions with the US EPA about some next steps, but we do want to try to complete this process certainly by mid to late October, if at all possible, to get this done so that US EPA can then share this with our federal partners as they further develop the action plan 4. And then finally, I'd like to thank Frank and Chairman Williams, who represented the interests of the tribes and the indigenous peoples, and help us to at least start to think about traditional ecological knowledge, and the different perspectives that the indigenous peoples have here on the Great Lakes, and how it might assist us and influence our recommendations. So just want to thank everybody for their participation, for the work of the GLAB, and also thank you for listening and participating in today's workshop.
Our
So,
thanks to you, Scudder, for all you've done.
yep, thank you. And I think, Todd, you are the official closer of the meeting. Is that correct?
That is correct. And Scott, I just want to echo Al and the rest of the board members. Thanks to you for your leadership and everything that you're doing for the board. Greatly appreciate that. It's no easy task that you have, and you're doing a great job. So thank you. And your thanks to everyone. I couldn't have said any better. And I'm not even going to try. So again, I just want to, on behalf of EPA, the Great Lakes National Program Office, and the rest of the agencies under the Regional Working Group, thank all of the board members for all of the time, effort, and passion that you are putting into this work. We greatly appreciate it, and no doubt will Action Plan 4 be better than the last. But I think more importantly, actually, it's going to be sort of how we implement it, because I think many of these recommendations are not just what's going to go in a document, but how we are going to implement the GLRI. So I really appreciate you coming to the table with that lens. And with that, I think we can adjourn the meeting.
Yep. Good. Thank you. Everybody have a good day and safe travels if you're going somewhere. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.